The Seaboard Coastline Railroad is a former Class I railroad company operating in the southeastern United States beginning in 1967. Its passenger operations were taken over by Amtrak in 1971. Eventually the railroad was merged with its affiliate lines to create the Seaboard system in 1983. At the end of 1970, SCL operated 9,230 miles of railroad, not including NAMP, WP Clinchfield CN and AMP, LGM Georgia L and AMP N Carrollton. That year it reported 31,293 million ton-miles of revenue freight and 512 million passenger miles. History. The Seaboard Coastline emerged on July 1, 1967, following the merger of the Seaboard Airline Railroad with the Atlantic Coastline Railroad. The combined system totaled 9,809 miles, the eighth largest in the United States at the time. The railroad had $1.2 billion in assets and revenue, with a 54% market share of rail service in the Southeast, facing competition primarily from the Southern. Prior to the creation of Amtrak on May 1, 1971, the Seaboard Coastline provided passenger service over much of its system, including local passenger trains on some lines. Local trains ended when the Amtrak era began, although several named passenger trains survived through the Amtrak era. Many were renamed or combined with other services. The first expansion for the Seaboard Coastline came in 1969 with the acquisition of the Piedmont and Northern Railway, which operated about 128 miles in North and South Carolina. SCL would buy out the remaining shares and gain control of the Louisville and Nashville Railroad in 1971, and the Durham and Southern Railway. On November 1, 1980, CSX Corporation was created as a holding company for the Family Lines and Chassis System Railroad. In 1983, CSX combined the Family Lines system units as the Seaboard System Railroad and later became CSX Transportation when the former chassis units merged with the Seaboard in December 1986. Effective January 1, 1983, the Seaboard Coastline Railroad became Seaboard System Railroad after a merger with the Louisville and Nashville Railroad and Clinchfield Railroad. For some years prior to this, the SCL and L and AMP N had been under the common ownership of a holding company, Seaboard Coastline Industries, the company's railroad subsidiaries being collectively known as the Family Lines System, which consisted of the L and AMP N, SCL, Clinchfield and West Point routes. During this time, the railroads adopted the same paint schemes but continued to operate as separate railroads. Notable SCL services. Juice Train. Juice Train is the popular name for famous unit trains of Tropicana fresh orange juice operated by railroads in the United States. On June 7, 1970, beginning on Seaboard Coastline Railroad, a mile-long Tropicana juice train began carrying 1 million gallons of juice with one weekly round trip from Bradenton, Florida to Kearny, New Jersey, in the New York City area. The trip spanned 1,250 miles one way, and the 60-car train was the equivalent of 250 trucks. Today operated by SCL successor CSX Transportation, CSX juice trains have been the focus of efficiency studies and awards as examples of how modern rail transportation can compete successfully against trucking and other modes to carry perishable products. Motive power. Immediately following the 1967 merger, the newly created SCL network had 1,232 locomotives. The vast majority of the ACL roster contained EMD locomotives, while the CEL rostered Baldwin and Alco diesels in addition to EMD builds. Both railroads had purchased new freight locomotives in the 5 years leading up to the merger. Among the first new locomotives purchased by the Seaboard coastline were 28 GEU 33B locomotives, acquired in 1967 and 1968. These were followed by 108 GEU 36B locomotives between 1970 and 1972. From EMD, SCL purchased SD45 locomotives in 1968, with more to follow in 1971. SD45-2 locomotives were added in 1974. GP40 and GP40-2 locomotives were added to the fleet between 1968 and 1972 for use on through freights and other high-priority freight trains. SCL supplemented its local freight units with orders of GEU 18B and EMD GP38 locomotives. Some U-18B models contained a shorter, and therefore lighter, fuel tank which proved ideal for light-density lines. Most units of this type were assigned to the Carolinas. However, in 1978 the SCL decided not to purchase any more locomotives for local service on secondary main lines and branch lines, instead aging GP7, GP9, and GP18 locomotives would be rebuilt into GP16 models at the USETA shops. In the years leading up to the creation of the Seaboard system in 1983, SCL began acquiring the next generation of locomotives from EMD and GE. These orders included GE B23-7 locomotives in 1978 and 1980, including the GE BQ23-7 variant, of which only 10 were built and all belonged to SCL. EMD GP38-2 units were added in 1979 and 1980, and 5 EMD GP40-2 locomotives also delivered in 1980. 6-axle GEC 30-7 and EMD SD40-2 units were added to the roster between 1979 and 1980. Divisions: Jacksonville, Tampa, Waycross, Florence, Rocky Mount, Savannah, Raleigh, Siena, Namp, L. GM Railroad, Atlanta,